book of Daniel, the prophet, as the Lord Jesus calls him, is rich in history and geography. Right from the first verse, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. There's history, there's people, place, and time. Not only is it rich in it, it's reliable in it. The scriptures are historically accurate. They're geographically accurate. Sure, there's been charges levied against the Bible, against Daniel in particular, such as saying, Belshazzar, who's he? He's not in the history until he's found. And that's happened over and over again. Belshazzar in the Nabonidus cylinder. And so the Bible holds up in the long run. So if there's some question you have even right now about something, perhaps you should go with innocent until proven guilty, because it's been demonstrated to be accurate so much. Not only is there history and geography, but there's sovereignty. The sovereignty of God over everything and in everything. He has his interests and his people, and you and I have the privilege of being part of his interest still today. But here we see Daniel and his friends, part of God's interest. The Lord handed over Jehoiakim. There's the sovereignty of God. It wasn't just a battle between two kings. The Lord handed over Jehoiakim, king of Judah, to him, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And there's the Lord's interest. They're touching the house of God and its vessels. And he, Nebuchadnezzar, brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And so there's a question of who's the real sovereign, who's the real God? And we'll find that the Lord is the Most High God, and those who align with him are doing the right thing, are making the right choice. Well, let's think a little bit more about the geography and the history. It'll help us in getting the layout of the book of Daniel. Now, the geography is really helpful to understand. We have Jerusalem, of course. We have Babylon, a city and also a kingdom, with Nebuchadnezzar ruling over it, eventually Belshazzar. So there's the people and the places. Then the Medes and Persians conquer Babylon. Susa's their capital city. Daniel's there at one point in Daniel. Then along come the Greeks. They're called out by name. Alexander the Great, not by name, but he's the notable horn of the Greeks. So the Greek Empire comes along, and then the Roman Empire comes along, and then the crucifixion of Christ. All these things are history that happened in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem's destroyed. It gets built, it gets desecrated. The Greek Empire gets split into two parts, the king in the north, the king in the south. That's geography. And the reason why they're called that is because it's north relative to Jerusalem, relative to Israel. And that's the Seleucids. And it's south relative to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's really what matters, though it sure seems like Antiochus IV is what's really happening. But that's not what's really happening. As the Seleucids and Ptolemies fight with each other, God's interest is right in between, with his people, with his temple. So the geography is very helpful, but then notice the sovereignty of God over it all. In the words of Daniel, there is a God in heaven. There is a God in heaven. Or as he says in Daniel 2:21, it is he who changes the times and the periods. He removes kings and appoints kings. So God is sovereign over it all. May the Lord help us to walk in the fear of God, that we recognize that there actually is a God in heaven, and it transforms our behavior then, like it did Daniel and his friends, and the Maccabees, the people that have been faithful to the Lord through the years. Are you faithful to the Lord like that? Do you live in the reality that there is a God in heaven? We see him by faith. So the sovereignty of God, the geography, but the sovereignty of God in all. Now the timeline, let's talk a little bit about that. As we think about the timeline, 605 BC is when Daniel's taken into Babylon. And then we could lay out the chapters, because there's a timestamp for most of them of when that happened. So chapter 1 is right at the beginning there, 605, he's taken to Babylon. Second year of Nebuchadnezzar is chapter 2. Chapter 3 and 4 are during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We don't know for sure exactly when that fell, but it's sometime during his reign. Now chapter 5 is actually the end of the Babylonian Empire, when Belshazzar is the day before it falls to the Persians, actually the day before the night when it fell to the Persians. So that's what's happening in chapter 5. And chapter 6 is during the Persian Empire, which is interesting to note, because that's about 70 years, just about 70 years since Daniel came. So Daniel was a teenager, say 15 or 18 or something. He comes, he's getting into his upper 80s when he's thrown into the lion's den in chapter 6. Now, not only do we have the historical books there, the chapter 1 to 6, but also we have these prophetic books. Now, chapter 2 is a prophetic chapter. Chapter 7, 8, they happened during Belshazzar's reign, so we could time those. Chapter 9 is during Persian reign, but near the beginning. Chapter 10 to 12, we're calling it chapter 11, is again just a couple years into that Medes and Persians reign. Now the The timeline touches on Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus and Belshazzar, and then Cyrus and Darius coming along. 539 is an important year. That's when the Persians conquered Babylon. Now, the temple got started in 535. That's talked about in the book of Ezra. And then also Haggai and Zechariah are trying to motivate the people to actually finish it, which they did 20 years later in 515. The book also talks about the fourth king from Cyrus, which is Xerxes I. He decides he wants to invade Greece, 480 BC. That's the book of Esther. So look at how interwoven the scriptures are and history is, and consistent it is with history and geography. Then Ezra eventually comes himself, and then Nehemiah comes, 445 BC, when the word to rebuild Jerusalem is given. Then the Greeks conquer, 331 BC. That's another year to know. Now notice the Greeks were called out by name more than 200 years before that in the book of Daniel. And Daniel was a prophet according to the Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ. If we say that that was written after the fact, then we're disagreeing with the Lord Jesus Christ. So the Lord Jesus says he's a prophet. He saw ahead of time Alexander the Great and his kingdom getting broken up into his 4 generals, which indeed it did, and then the 6 Syrian wars with the Syria, the Seleucids, and Egypt, the Ptolemies fighting with each other, Israel in between. Near the end of that, Antiochus IV, he eventually desecrates the temple, 167 BC, but then it's cleansed by the Maccabees, 164 BC, important time frame, and it's referred to in chapter 8 and chapter 11 of Daniel. Then, of course, along comes Rome. We get into the AD. Jesus of Nazareth comes at the right time, rides into Jerusalem, but he's rejected, so he's crucified or cut off, as Daniel chapter 9 prophesies. And then the temple's destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. The city and the temple are destroyed, like Daniel prophesied and like the Lord Jesus affirmed, even in making reference to Daniel. And so this timeline starts to get a framework for us, and we can connect the chapters with that, which we'll do in a minute. But as we think about all these things, we want to make sure we're noticing the sovereignty of God over it, and we want to notice God's interests, God's concerns. We talk about the temple. We see the temple getting burned by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. That's a really important thing. But then the temple getting rebuilt is such a burden to Daniel. He's praying about it in chapter 9. He's praying about it in chapter 10. In fact, he was praying for 3 weeks, and there's spiritual warfare in the heavenly places going on during those 3 weeks. The Lord help us to see prayer as real and touching real things. The people had gone back like they were allowed. Daniel was too old to go back, but man, he was back there in his heart. May the Lord help us to have that kind of heart, that kind of concern for his interests, that as the politics, the current events, they come and go, but the Lord's interests, that's what we really want to be in for. And so Daniel was a great example of that. So Zerubbabel comes back, they rebuild the temple. Eventually Nehemiah comes back. This is God's concerns. This is what Daniel's heart was for, is that the temple would be rebuilt, that the city of God would be rebuilt, the people of God, that they would be affected, they'd be consecrated, they'd be holy for God. The temple gets desecrated by Antiochus, and so the people that know their God are strong and take action. Then Messiah comes. That's what's really going on. I mean, the Romans thought they were all that, but they were just part of God's program. They're just a stage for God's program to be fulfilled. The Lord helped me to see it that way, that I walk in the fear of God. The temple being destroyed, that really mattered. But the temple apparently is going to be rebuilt again, because the prince that shall come is going to cause the sacrifice to cease in the middle of that 7-year period that's yet future. So that apparently there's going to be a temple and sacrifices again. And that ultimately the Son of Man is going to come, and those that align with him will be blessed and enter into the kingdom. So the chapters of Daniel we could lay across this timeline. Just briefly, we'll do that here. So chapter 2, there's a statue, the head of gold, Babylon, the silver, the Medes and Persians, bronze, Greece, the iron, Rome, that apparently has 2 phases in it, because there's the iron, but then eventually the feet, they turn into iron mixed with clay. It's a kind of a second phase. But ultimately the stone comes, destroys the statue, and God's kingdom is established. Chapter 7, looking at the kings of men not as glorious, but as vicious, like they really are. A lion, Babylon, the bear lifted up on one side, the Medes and Persians, a leopard, the swiftness of it, like in Alexander the Great, the Greeks. And then this terrible beast, this 4th beast, paralleling Rome, this terrible beast that comes along, and the little horn at the tail end of that, rising up, speaking blasphemy, persecuting the saints of God, the nation of Israel. But ultimately, those that have aligned with the Son of Man, the saints of God, are given the kingdom. That's chapter 7. Now, chapter 8 focuses in on Greece and the Medes and Persians as the ram, and then that's replaced by the male goat, and is called out as the Medes and Persians and Greece. This is, again, more than 200 years before Greece had risen to power. The notable horn at the beginning of that, and then a little horn towards the end of that in chapter 8. Antiochus IV, his desecration of the temple and the cleansing of the temple are talked about in chapter 8. Now, chapter 9 gives a timeline for the people of God. That's where God's real concerns are. It's interesting in Daniel, chapter 2 to 7, have this language shift to Aramaic. It's kind of like the language of the world, but chapter 1 and then chapter 8 on is in Hebrew, because this is about really God's interest with his people. Beautiful. Now, chapter 9 is focusing on that. Daniel's burden, he's praying about it, and God reveals to him 70 periods of 7 years, or 70 weeks, as we say. 69 of them to go from the word to rebuild Jerusalem with Nehemiah up to Messiah the Prince. And then there's a break, evidently, a parenthesis, if you want to think of it that way, or a valley in that prophecy. Messiah's cut off, the temple's destroyed, but that's not during the 70th seven. The 70th seven is going to start with a covenant by a false prince with the nation of Israel. In the middle of it, he calls the sacrifice to cease. But ultimately, in the end, with lots of desolation along the way, the temple will be cleansed, the holy place will be anointed, and everlasting righteousness will be brought in. And then finally, chapter 10 to 12, with most of it in chapter 11, talks about the Cyrus and the fourth king from Cyrus, like we mentioned already. And then it zooms out to Alexander the Great, the king, a notable king. And then the kings of the north and the king of the south and their battles with each other, almost like a play-by-play of the politics of that. And then after Antiochus IV, it again zooms forward, this time to the time of the end, where there's the king. And he's even battling with the king of the north and king of the south. So it's not just that time frame. It's the king who thinks he's God. But ultimately, the people will be delivered. They'll be rescued. The nation of Israel, your people, Daniel, will be rescued. Israel evidently having been reestablished, and yet there's a great persecution of them, and ultimately honor to the Lord at the end of that. So in this lay of the chapters, as we think about Daniel, as we think about our lives, may the Lord help us to think about God's interest in it all. May the Lord help us to have great confidence in his word too. It's faithful. It's historically accurate. It's prophetically accurate. The Lord Jesus believed it. May the Lord help us to believe it and to act accordingly.